Thanks very much. Hi everyone, good morning. Thanks for joining us this morning. So yeah, as mentioned, today's session is about sensory support strategies in the classroom. Now obviously quite a big topic and quite a lot to get into in a relatively short space of time. So today's going to kind of be a bit of a general overview of different presentations of sensory integration differences and so on, with obviously opportunity for questions at the end. So if there's anything that we don't quite cover, excuse me, that you're a little bit interested in and you have some questions about maybe specific children or young people that you're working with and maybe that's not quite covered in the session, please feel free to ask a question at the end and we can get you the answer, or I can at least get you to the right person who's got that answer. I've also popped my email address on the slides as well. So if we don't get a chance to get to your question, or if you think of something afterwards, please feel free to give me an email and I'm more than happy to either help or point you in the right direction. I'll also, when we get to the chat at the end, I'll copy and paste my email address in that chat box so you can copy and paste it from there if needs be. Just to give you a quick little bit of background about myself so you can kind of see where I'm coming from. Before I started working with the foundation, I was a primary teacher for 5 years. And I now currently work in the foundation doing therapeutic interventions for children and young people who are neurodiverse, you know, whether diagnosed or not. Lots of them with kind of sensory integration, sensory processing differences, and a lot of the support I do is around that as well, and around maybe some of those self-calming strategies or those self-regulation strategies for when there is kind of that sensory overload, all of which we're going to get into this morning. So in terms of what we're going to aim to do in the next sort of 40 minutes before we do some questions, we're going to look at a variety of sensory integration differences, and we're going to do that by exploring 8 senses today. So we're going to talk about the 5 that we know, you know, sight, smell, sound, and so on. And then there's 3 others that we're going to look at as well, which you may well have heard of. Then we're going to look how this can kind of present in a classroom setting. So what it might look like for us as educational professionals, and how that might be presenting there, and some of the challenges, I suppose, that come with that. And then look at loads of support strategies and adjustments that we can provide to really support these children and young people with sensory differences, if you like. So what is sensory integration? Well, it's how we experience, interpret, react to, or sometimes ignore our information coming from our senses. So what happens is we have sensory receptors, and they're different depending on which sense that we're looking at. So sight, for example, obviously our sensory receptors are our eyes. Smell, it might be our nose, and so on. But our sensory receptors pick up different stimuli. And then this information basically gets passed along nerve cells to the brain. The brain then processes or organizes this information. So that's basically how it works. But what we do know is that some people will have differences in these areas, but the senses we're going to look at, so we've mentioned sight already, sound, taste, touch, and smell. But then there are 3 others which, excuse me, don't often get spoken about. You may or may not have heard of these before. So first one is proprioception. Then our vestibular sense, and then interoception. So just to start us off with proprioception, it often gets described as like the body's sat-nav system. It's basically how we perceive the position and movement of our body. So without it, if we didn't have this sense, we'd have to think through, if we were walking down the road, we'd have to think through every step that we were taking, but usually we don't have to do that. It just kind of happens for us. We know where our body parts are, we know the position of our body parts, and we're able to kind of do it without having to think that process through. So a great way of kind of showing this, if I was to ask you to close your eyes, so you can do this now if you like, close your eyes and then touch one of your elbows. Chances are you're probably able to do that. I've just done it there. I can close my eyes and touch my elbow. Chances are you're probably able to do that with your eyes closed. That's proprioception in action, because you know the position of your body parts, you know where things are. So it's essentially that awareness of where things are happening in your body, and you know where the position of your body. It often gets described as our sat-nav. Then we've got our vestibular sense. So this often gets described as our balance sense or our gravity sense. It is what supports us with that balance and stops us from being falling over all the time. It allows us to move smoothly. The receptors for this light, and it's all to do with the inner ear. So when we see someone who is maybe oversensitive with their vestibular sense, it might be kind of motion sickness. And I'm sure if anyone's experienced vertigo before, you'll know what it feels like when this vestibular sense is kind of hypersensitive. Then we got our interoception as well. Now, this is what helps us to sense our internal signals. So some examples would be when you feel hungry, that physical response, being able to pick up on that response that you need to go and eat. Or it might be feeling like you need the toilet. Also, when you have maybe been on a run and your heart's beating really, really fast, and the fact that you can feel that, that's your interoceptive sense at work. Now, all 8 of these senses here are all in play all of the time. So I'm sat here now and I'm using all 8 of these senses. So my sight, I can see the screen that I'm looking at the slides, I'm reading from there. Sometimes I might be a little bit distracted by what's going on out of the window, and that my kind of visual sense is drawing me to there a little bit, but I'm using it pretty well in terms of looking at the screen and seeing what's going on. I'm using sound, I'm listening to the sound of my own voice, I'm listening to the builders outside and making sure it's not too loud so that you can still hear me on this call. Taste, I've just brushed my teeth and I can taste the toothpaste there still. Touch, I mean, I'm someone who is very kind of makes a lot of gestures and fiddles with my hands a lot, so I'm constantly using that as I'm talking now. Smell, I can smell the kind of candle that's burning over there. And then my proprioception, again, as I'm sat here now and as I'm kind of gesticulating, I'm not having to think through every step that I make with my hands or anything like that. It's just sort of happening. I know where they are. My vestibular sense is helping me to stay on this chair and keep my head upright without me kind of falling over and get dizzy. And my interoceptive sense, well, I'm feeling a little bit thirsty, so I'm going to take a drink of water in a second, but I can recognize those internal signals. Now, all 8 of these senses basically help us to navigate our way through life. And we'd be lost without them. Unfortunately, sometimes they don't work effectively for some people. So we might find that someone is hyposensitive in some of these areas, and what that means is that they are actually undersensitive. So the receptors, it's not picking up enough of that input. So this is why we might see some of those sensory seeking behaviors. So looking out for more further input of that sense, or it might be hypersensitivity, so that's why we're oversensitive. So real kind of heightened experience or heightened input of those senses, and this is where we might see some of those sensory avoiding behaviors. Now, these kind of like differences in sensory integration is very strongly linked with neurodiversity. So neurodiversity, we know we're talking about lots of different conditions here: ADHD, autism, dyslexia, etc. Sensory processing disorders are often really associated with autism. However, across the neurodiversity umbrella, we do find sensory integration differences. I myself have got ADHD, and I know that my sensory processing does work slightly differently. And I know that I am a bit more hypersensitive in some areas and actually hyposensitive in other areas. But the interesting thing and the frustrating thing, I suppose, for when we're working with people with sensory differences is there's no kind of hard and fast rules, and they do change, and they might change from day to day. So keeping an eye on how that sensory profile develops and changes is really, really important. Now, I'm going to attempt to play a video on here now, and sometimes we do have a little bit of issue playing videos on GoToWebinar. I'll try and play it. If it works, if the audio, it might be the audio that doesn't work. If it doesn't work, just let me know in the chat. And I'll just put a link in there and you can watch it in your own time. So we'll give it a go anyway. So this video is from the National Autistic Society. So I'll give it a play. If you just let me know in the chat whether or not it's working or not. Essentially, in case it does work, I'll give you a bit of context for it. So this is basically a simulation of this young man here, and it's basically his hypersensitivity and his kind of sensory overload and that overstimulation of some of his senses that's going on for him. So I'll give it a go. If it's not working, let me know, and I'll pop the link in at the end. Oh, try again. Okay, it's not working anyway. I think it's to do with the connection. What I will do is I will just pop that in the chat at the end for you. But essentially what we find is in this video, what you'll find when you do watch it, is this young man's walking through like a shopping centre, and there's lots of things going on that's really kind of drawing his attention and really overstimulating him. So this little kind of like toy bike thing here is making this really loud noise for him, and it's really kind of overwhelming. And when you actually listen to it in the video, it's really not very pleasant at all. And the idea is that the volume that that noise is playing at on the video is not a real reflection of how loud the thing actually is, but actually to him, and if he's got that hypersensitivity, that's exactly how it feels to him. It's really, really loud. It's really overwhelming. He walks past this photo booth, and the noise of the camera going off and the flash really kind of draws his attention, and he keeps looking to his mum throughout and squeezing his mum's hand, and he just needs that extra comfort. So what we do know is that sensory differences can be really overwhelming for children and young people, and it can really lead to some of those emotional breakdowns. Sometimes people call them meltdowns as well. Now, to make sense of that, we have to kind of look at how our brain works. So you've probably heard of this before, you may or may not have, the chimp brain. So essentially we're going to look at two parts of the brain here, our limbic system there and the frontal part of our brain. Now in this book, The Chimp Paradox, Dr. Steve Peters uses this kind of metaphor of a chimp brain to really describe the different processes that the different parts of our brain do, and it helps us to kind of make sense of those extreme emotions and emotional dysregulation. So our limbic system basically is the like emotional hub of our brain, and it's what triggers it's got our amygdala in it, which triggers our fight, flight or freeze response. So when we feel, when we sense danger, that triggers that response for us. And the frontal part of our brain is like the logical, the human brain. It helps us to think things through, and actually, you know, to think things through rationally and make decisions. Now, both of them serve their purpose. We need kind of a healthy balance of both. For example, if you're stood in the middle of the road and there's a car coming towards you, you do want to be operating from that limbic part of your brain, because you don't want to be thinking, should I get out the way? How many steps do I need to take to get out of the way of this car? You just want that panic to set in and just to help you to get out the way as quick as possible. Where that becomes an issue is when we're operating from that emotional part of our brain, when there is no danger. Because when we are operating from that emotional part of our brain, we're not able to think rationally, we're not able to think logically about things, and it can cause some quite intense distress. Now, for those with sensory differences, they might find that being overstimulated can actually lead to operating from that limbic system and those extreme feelings of anxiety and just needing to get away from it all. And often what we will find is when they are, when someone is overwhelmed in terms of their sensory input, they will be operating from that limbic system and they will be feeling that fight, flight or freeze response. And it's important that we recognize that and help them to start to regulate and calm down as well. And in terms of what we use, that's all going to depend on their sensory profile, something we'll get into in a second. Then the frontal part of our brain there is obviously when we're operating from there, we're able to think rationally about things and we're able to think logically. Now, for those who are neurodiverse, especially those with ADHD, their limbic systems work very, very hard, and we will find that they are often operating from there more often than in comparison to those without ADHD. And that frontal part of the brain is actually smaller in those with ADHD. It actually takes longer to develop. So we're going to see them operating from that limbic system. And when we throw sensory integration differences into the mix, it can cause some real issues. A good example of kind of explaining this is something that I use with a lot of the kids I work with. So we take our hand like this, our thumb goes there, that's our limbic system, and these four fingers sit over the top. That's the frontal part of our brain there. So when our brain looks like this, we're thinking logically, we feel calm. But when we sense danger, we flip our lid, we stop using this part of our brain, and we're operating from here, this emotional part of our brain. So if you've got someone, for example, who does experience that sort of sensory overload and does feel quite overwhelmed, when that's happening for them, this is probably what's going to happen, and they're going to be operating in the classroom from this limbic system. They're going to be really, really emotional. They're not going to be able to think logically or rationally. But there are things that we can do to help them to calm and start to use this part of their brain again. So The first thing to do, in my opinion, when working with a child or young person is to actually build a sensory profile of them specifically, because as we know, everyone is going to be different. So you can use a sensory checklist to do this. Now, there's 2 links there. The first one, I'll put both of these in the chat at the end as well. The first one of those 2 links is a sensory checklist free to download from Twinkle. So basically what it does, it asks you a series of questions relating to those 8 senses that we spoke about before, and it helps you to kind of score whether they might be oversensitive, whether they might be undersensitive, that hypo or hyper, whether they've kind of got a decent balance, and it just helps you to kind of identify areas of need in terms of their sensory input. And that second link there is basically a guide that goes along with that. So when you've got that profile there, basically tells you what to do with that profile and what sort of things that we should be putting in. But what I'm going to do is go through some of those senses and talk about sort of different accommodations and what it might look like if they're oversensitive or undersensitive. And then we'll look at some general support strategies, and then look at some of those de-escalation strategies and that self-calming for when that overwhelm and that chimp brain does kick in. So firstly, we'll look at the visual sense. So if someone is hyposensitive, so that undersensitivity, we might see them sort of bumping into things quite a lot, tripping over things. They might really gravitate and be really interested in bright colours and patterns, especially in the younger years as well. Now, in terms of adjustments to make for these, firstly, I'd think about where they're sat in the room. So it might be better for them to be sat near the front, so that they can see everything. It's there for them, especially if they need that extra input. You're right there in front of them. When we're giving them things to read, it might be worth highlighting things, so key bits of information to really draw their attention to that. Having some sort of space where they can go that's really visually stimulating if they need that input to help them to regulate, because often what we see, especially with this hyposensitivity as well, is that it can actually be used as a self-regulation strategy. So if someone's feeling a little bit dysregulated, if that's the kind of input they need, if they can go somewhere where it's really visually stimulating for them, can actually help them to start to self-regulate and calm down. Coloured paper might be an option as well, just in terms of trying to really to bring out that visual input as much as possible. And then if someone's hypersensitive, so that oversensitivity, and they might be showing some of that sensory avoiding behavior, they might prefer low lighting and they'll avoid kind of bright colors and light. So again, for them, think about where they're sat in the room. So maybe the front won't be the best place for them because maybe the board's really bright. Also think about where they're sat in terms of if they're directly under, you know, a fluorescent light, it might not be the best place for them. So think about the best place to sit them in the room. And that's going to be common with when we're talking about lots of different senses, is actually seating positions in the room. The best thing I think you can do is just ask them where they think is going to be best for them, especially if they're a little bit older and they've got that self-understanding and just having that trust in the first place. And then obviously if it doesn't work, we can kind of rearrange, but just talk to them about where they think they'll be less distracted. Having a sensory friendly space, so you know, lots of schools have got sensory rooms. If you can have somewhere within the classroom too, somewhere that they can go, even if it's a tent at the back. I mean, I've seen this in secondary schools as well, like a little teepee at the back of the room. So if they just need to go and just kind of reduce some of that input a little bit, just to help them to regulate and calm down, just a space within the room is good. And the reason that I like having spaces in the classroom rather than having to go to the sensory room outside all the time it's just because they're not always that child who has to leave the room and everyone's looking at them leave the room. They can stay within that environment and under your care, and still kind of get what they need. So having sort of a sensory friendly space can help with that too. In terms of you know, being outdoors, allowing them to wear sunglasses and hats on the playground and things, obviously, you know, we'll have different rules in different schools about this, but if it is something that's going to cause them stress and cause them distress, it might be worth just letting them do that. And then another thing that's thought to help those who are hypersensitive with kind of visual stimuli is actually having some predictable visual flows. And a great example of this is a lava lamp. So it's visual stimuli for them there, but it's predictable and they can see what's going to happen. And it's thought to kind of help to manage some of those feelings and help to desensitize a little bit. Now, in terms of the auditory sense to what we hear, If someone's hyposensitive, so undersensitive, they might seem like they're really noisy. So they might not kind of be aware of the volume of their own voice and talk really loudly all the time. They might listen to things that, you know, on an iPad in a classroom or a laptop, they might have the volume really, really loud. They might need you to talk really loudly to them before they actually respond to what you're saying. You might need to say their name several times. In terms of adjustments for these kids, the best things, firstly, using as many visuals as possible or written handouts, and trying not to rely on verbal instruction alone for these kids, because the chances are, if they're kind of undersensitive in this area, they've probably missed something that you've said. So just following up every verbal instruction with written instruction, maybe pictures, visuals, just having those extra handouts as well to back up what you're actually verbally asking them to do. If they are using computers and iPads and stuff in certain lessons, just giving them a pair of headphones to use, because, you know, they can still listen to it as loud as they want to, but it's not distracting other people. And if we're asking them to turn it down, chances are they've probably got it really loud for a reason. So if we're asking them to turn it down, they might not be getting the most out of it. So just providing headphones can be the difference there. And then again, think about where they're sat in the room. So for these kids, I would say as close to the front as possible, really, just so that they can definitely hear what's going on. And then if someone is hypersensitive with sound, these might become very easily distressed by loud noise. They might become easily distracted by little things that are going on. And this is certainly from my experience of ADHD. This is definitely heavily linked with me. Very easily distracted by noise, and the slightest little things can draw my attention away. So there's a few ways of kind of dealing with this, really. We can use ear defenders, so ways of drowning out all sound altogether. Sometimes these can work. Some people find these quite distracting. I certainly do, especially when ADHD is in the mix. If we've got a hyperactive mind as well, as soon as there's complete silence, often what we find is that your own thoughts start to distract you then as well, whereas white noise can really help to drown out sound without it being completely silent and distracting. Give an advanced warning of loud sounds where possible. If you know it's something that's going to cause distress, it might be worth just telling these 1 or 2 kids that the fire drill is going to go off at 1 o'clock that day, just so that they've got time to prepare for it. Maybe they can put their ear defenders on just before. And then again, like we mentioned with the kind of tent and things before, just having a space that they can go, a quiet space for when that overwhelm does kick in and when they do start to feel that kind of sensory overload with sound, just somewhere quiet that they can go to calm down and regulate. And then in terms of touch and the tactile sense, so those who are undersensitive, hyposensitive, they might seem like they're really rough, or they play really rough, especially in the younger years. And they might squeeze really hard with things, or even if they're holding someone's hand, they might squeeze really hard. They might appear to be very touchy-feely, and they're kind of always looking for that input. Good support here is just giving them heavy jobs to do and allowing them to use fidget resources to get that sensory input. Bubble wrap and poppets are a great way of doing this. Obviously, bubble wrap's a bit noisy, so the poppets might be a bit more appropriate because they're not too loud. And then weighted resource as well, and giving them that deep pressure and that input there. So weighted blankets, weighted wristbands, all of that sort of stuff. When we talk about some self-regulation strategies in a second, I'll go into a little bit more detail on those as well. And then if someone is hypersensitive with the tactile sense, they might be really anxious about being close to other people. They might feel uncomfortable in their clothes. They might need the kind of tags cutting off their clothes and things like that. For these kids, give advance warning before touching them where possible, and have something agreed with them that, wait, I'm coming over to you now. If you need to tap them on the shoulder, just let them know that it's going to happen. Again, think about where they're sat, and they might be best in a space on their own, or having a little bit of extra space. If they're surrounded by lots of people, that might cause them some anxiety, and actually it's not going to help them to learn. And then in terms of lining up and things like that in primary school, just letting them stand at the back of the line and having that as their place if that's what they feel better with, rather than being in the middle and kind of surrounded by everyone. And then, okay, we're going to look at those other 3 now as well. So the proprioceptive sense. So if someone's hyposensitive, and what we'll find is lots of these are linked, especially this one's quite linked with the visual as well, and the vestibular too. So the hyposensitive, so those who are undersensitive with this proprioceptive sense, they might appear really clumsy and they might bump into things all the time. If we remember what that proprioceptive sense is, it's being aware of the position of your body, essentially. So giving them heavy jobs to do can really help. So to kind of give them that extra input where needed. So giving them the stack of books to hand out and things like that, and giving them that heavy work. Deep pressure, like we've mentioned before, resistance bands as well. A great way of doing this is tying a resistance band around the front two legs of the chair, and they can put their legs behind that and then sort of kick out while they're working, so they're getting that input that they need and they're still sat down working. And then just thinking about the setup of the room as well, and trying to minimize as many kind of obstacles that they've got to get through as possible. Now, I know full well that's much easier said than done. I can think about some of the classrooms that I worked in, but where possible, just trying to consider the setup of that room there. And then for those who are hypersensitive to that proprioceptive sense, so oversensitive, quite similar to that kind of tactile sense that I mentioned there, and that touch, is that they might become quite anxious when touched. They might become easily tired after standing if they've if that kind of they've got that extra input of that. Things like yoga can help, and calming activities and meditation. And what that does is, sometimes we think about meditation about, we all kind of do this guided meditation on YouTube, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that. It can just be a moment of quiet, playing some sort of some music, and just kind of being aware of the position of your body parts, and just helping those who are kind of oversensitive to that to just kind of regulate and calm and make sense of those things. And again, just thinking about where they're sat. For that vestibular sense, that balance, those who are undersensitive, they might be these, especially the little ones, who can just spin forever without feeling dizzy. They might rock back and forth. They might appear really energetic. For these kids, definitely important to allow them to fidget while they work, if that's something that's going to help them to regulate and concentrate. Incorporate as much movement as possible, using balancing activities like a balance board, yoga and things like that. I mean, the best example I can think of, I had this lad who I used to teach who was definitely kind of hyposensitive in terms of this vestibular sense, and he would spend as much time as he possibly could in the day upside down. He'd be on the playground hanging upside down from the monkey bars. His mum said at home he'd watch the TV upside down, but it was just for him. He didn't really get that sense of dizziness or that motion sickness, and he was actually seeking out that input quite a lot. Because he was hyposensitive with that vestibular sense, so he needed that vestibular input as much as possible. And then hypersensitive for this, they might become really easily dizzy quite quickly. They might dislike sports for those sort of reasons and activities. So for these kids, give as much, when we're doing physical activity with them, as much predictability as possible. So games like catch and things like that, where they know they can see what's going to happen, and not something that's going to kind of suddenly make them move really quickly and sprint around and stuff that's going to make them quite dizzy. So just predictability and kind of building that up as much as possible. Again, having a calm space for when they do start to feel that dizziness. If you're out on a school bus and things, letting them sit at the front to try and reduce some of that motion sickness too. And then in terms of that interoceptive sense, those who are undersensitive, they might not recognize signs of stress. They might not recognize that they need the toilet, so using reminders and apps and things and social stories can help. There's a body outline activity that you can do for all of these things, whether it's hunger, needing the toilet, signs of stress. We'll come on to that in a second. And those who are oversensitive, they might actually feel quite overwhelmed by internal signals, and the one that comes up most often, especially with some of the kids I work with, is like the beating of the heart. They feel really overwhelmed by that, and they think that they're, something bad's really happening, and actually it's not. They've just been for a little run outside and their heart's beating a little bit quicker. Often the irony of it is that the more they start to panic about it, the heart beats even quicker, and then those signs of stress, and then it kind of makes them feel even worse. But they might be really overwhelmed by those internal signals. So for these kids, allowing timeouts as much as possible when they do feel that, incorporating relaxation techniques as much as possible, and breathing techniques as well can really help, because obviously that's going to slow our heartbeat down. Take 10 breathing is a great way of doing this, especially for these kids, because you might have heard of it before. It does come at a cost, I think, but essentially it's an iPad app, and you get a little kind of sensor with it. So you plug the sensor into the iPad, you clip it onto your ear or your finger, and it basically monitors your heartbeat. So if you've got someone who's kind of getting quite overwhelmed by the heartbeat, you can use that and it can monitor it for you. And as you breathe in and out, it shows you your heartbeat starting to slow down. And it's quite a nice visual, and it can really help them to see that actually they don't need to panic. Their heart is starting to slow down again. It's a really great resource to use. It does come at a cost, however, and the different ways of doing it, you can just watch the heartbeat. You can use like games where you've got to kind of keep the car on the tracks, and the slower your heart rate, it'll stay more steady and things like that. But definitely worth having a little look into. And then in terms of more general supports, sometimes, especially for those who kind of struggle to kind of verbalize their emotions and verbalize their feelings. What we want to see with those with sensory differences is we want to know when they're starting to feel a little bit overwhelmed or they're starting to feel stressed. So using visuals can help this, especially if you've got someone who isn't that great at kind of telling you. They might not even recognize those signs themselves sometimes, but having some sort of scale that they can point to. I work with a girl who has like different smiley faces on her desk, and she doesn't always want to put her hand up when she needs a little time out, but she just turns this card over and it's like to the sad face, and the teacher knows that she needs to go and have a little break. If you know that there's going to be kind of activities that might be a little bit overwhelming, just scheduling in those calm breaks before and after, just to try and aid that a little bit. Sometimes in terms of, you know, some of these senses can lead to difficulties, especially when we think about the kind of the proprioception and the tactile sense. They might lead to issues around boundaries and personal space. So sometimes taping out sections of the desk and things can help, or for some of the little ones, having designated spots on the carpet that they sit in. Sticking to routines wherever possible, not always going to be easy. And actually, one thing that I found really helpful when we're looking at things to do with sensory integration is actually asking the kids themselves to make a list of distractions, because sometimes you'll be surprised by some of the things they come up with. I was working with a young man recently who he was sat at the front of the classroom, and I asked him to make a list of the things that distract him. It was really surprising, some of the things that he put. He mentioned the clock ticking at the front of the room. He mentioned the board was making like a buzzing sound. He said his teacher, as his teacher was writing on the board, she had like a bracelet on that was jangling. It was really distracting him. But we wouldn't have kind of thought of those things had we not asked him directly to make a list of those things. So not going to be appropriate with everyone, of course, but sometimes might be appropriate to ask them to make a list of what actually distracts them. Sensory assault courses, or you might have heard of these as sensory circuits, are also a great way of trying to manage some of those sensory differences too. So there's 3 stages to it. Now you can actually start with any of these stages, but we finish with the calming stage there. So you can do it in any order. But so it kind of goes back to the start again. So you might start with organising, then you do calming, alerting, organising again, back to calming. And it's up to you what you think they need best, but we'd always finish with that calming stage. So with the alerting stage, what that does is it basically is a way of raising our heart rate. So it might be something that we've got like a little trampoline that they're going to bounce on for a little bit. They might do some star jumps, things like that. It helps with a couple of things. It raises that heart rate, so it actually helps in terms of some of that interoception. We can talk about our heart beating, and we can talk about the fact the reason that our heart's beating and it's pumping, oxygen, you know, all of that sort of stuff. We can talk about the reasons why and try and help to reduce some of that panic if they're hypersensitive to that. It helps us with that vestibular sense as well in terms of balance, and then we've got that proprioceptive simulation too, in terms of we know where our body is as we're bouncing on that trampoline, or we're having to organise our body as we do those star jumps. Then we have the organising stage. So the organising stage, what it means by organising is organising your body parts. So this is really great for the proprioceptive input, and so it might be like a little obstacle course, kind of beams that they have to balance on and walk through and things like that. And there's loads of different ideas. You'll find loads of different kind of ideas for sensory circuits online as well. And Twinkle, again, I'm not sponsored by Twinkle, by the way. Twinkle have got a great resource on sensory circuits, and there's one for primary age kids, there's one for secondary age kids as well, and sort of more appropriate strategies for them, so definitely worth having a look at. And then we've got that calming stage as well, and what this helps us with is that it helps that limbic system. If we are feeling a little bit overwhelmed or we are feeling a bit stressed, it's just some of those relaxation techniques, and it's just a good opportunity to teach those, and we can practice them outside of the sensory circuits as well. So definitely worth having a look into those. Now, I just want to finish off the sort of last 10 minutes thinking about emotional regulation, because it's definitely a massive part of sensory support strategies, because when we are working with people with sensory integration differences, we are going to see some emotional dysregulation as well. Now, where we want children and young people to be is that bottom point there. We want them to be able to regulate their emotions. Now, what that means is that they're able to actually recognize that, oh, I feel a little bit stressed or I feel a little bit overwhelmed, and know what to do in order to help themselves to calm. But we can't regulate until we can actually recognize the physical sensations that come with those feelings. So it might be butterflies in the stomach, it might be a tightness in the chest, or whatever it is for that person. We can't regulate until we actually recognize and associate those feelings with the emotion. We can't do that until we actually have a good understanding of emotions. And the amount of kids I work with who have 2 words in their emotional vocab, and it's happy and sad, or good and bad, or sometimes with some of the older ones just 2 slightly different sounding grunts. But actually there's such a broad spectrum and broad range of emotions that we're dealing with, and the more we can help them to understand that, the more we can help them to recognize and associate those physical sensations with those emotions. So it starts with, if they can't do it themselves, especially for some of the younger ones, it starts with us labeling it for them. So it's perfectly fine to say, they can't tell you how they're feeling, perfectly fine to say, I think that you're feeling like this. So you might say, I think that you're feeling frustrated. And what's really important is that we link it to an actual physical thing as well. So we might say, I think you're feeling frustrated because you're clenching your fists. And what we're essentially trying to get them to do is associate that when they do that, or when they feel that tightness in their chest, or however that feeling is for them, the more we reinforce that, we're trying to get them to associate that physical sensation with the word we used, frustration. And that's how we build up our understanding of emotions. And when we've got a good understanding of emotions, and when we can kind of say, I feel like this, I feel like that, I feel like this, that's when we can start to think about recognizing those physical sensations. So a great way of doing this is using, this is what we're trying to recognize, our fight, flight, or freeze response. A great way of doing this is using something like this, the body outline template. So we would ask someone, when you feel overwhelmed, when you feel stressed, well, what does it feel like in your body? So you can use a template like this. For some of the younger ones, you might use a picture of them. It's completely up to you. And you either get them to write, draw, colour in, all of that sort of stuff, where they feel it in their body. So it might be butterflies in the stomach, it might be a headache, it might be kind of clenched fists or sweaty palms, it might be a tightness in the chest. One of my colleagues said she was working with a young girl recently who said she gets lightning in her feet when she feels stressed. Whatever, it doesn't, even if we don't fully understand what they mean by it, as long as it means something to them, that's what's important. Because when they can then recognize those things, and when they can start to put those kind of feelings and connect them to that physical sensation, we can then start to regulate. And this is also great for some of those interoceptive signals as well. So if you've got someone especially who's hyposensitive with that interoception, so maybe not recognizing those internal signals around going to the toilet, around feeling hungry, all of that sort of stuff, using a resource like this and drawing on something like this could be a first step in sort of helping with that. But once we've got that understanding, once we can recognize, we can do a few things. So sometimes we might need relaxation as a regulation strategy. So using breathing techniques, I've mentioned the take 10 breathing. You can use take 5 breathing, which is basically get your hand like that and you trace round. As you go up, you breathe in through your nose. As you go down, you breathe out through your mouth. Yoga and meditation, we've already mentioned some apps there that are great for kind of for relaxation and meditation. Those first 2, great for all ages. The last 2, Move, Clear, Fear, maybe bit more appropriate for some of the older ones. And then sometimes in terms of relaxation, a little distraction or going to another place can help. And this is something that I do with lots of the kids I work with, ask them to go to their safe place. So they close their eyes and they imagine somewhere where they feel really safe, really calm, really happy. And then we just talk through the senses there and we say, okay, what can you smell when you're there? What can you see? What can you feel? What can you hear? All of that sort of stuff. And all we're trying to do there is just help them to feel calm again and just distract their brain a little bit and stop it going like this and just keep it like this. But sometimes we might need that more physical input, especially depending on that sensory profile as well. And what that comes out with. So we might need a more grounding kind of technique. So sometimes this is a physical input, a physical sensation, like a weighted wristband, a weighted blanket, resistance bands, stress balls, all of that sort of stuff, dumbbells. You know, you can do it homemade in lots of different ways as well. So it might be that you've got an Argos catalogue in a backpack or Yellow Pages in a backpack. I was in a school recently who had a pair of oven gloves and they put bags of rice in the pockets and stitched them up. And they just sat on the kids' laps as like weighted blankets and things like that, just a cheaper way of doing that. Sometimes maybe distraction techniques can be quite good as well. A couple that I like, first one is called Count the Colours. So basically what you do is you pick a colour and you might say, right, say it's blue, tell me as many blue things as you can see in this room, and they'll count all the blue things, and you ask them to close their eyes and imagine as many blue things as they can. And all we're trying to do there is just redirect their train of thought and just try and distract their brain and start to get to think about something else. And it's not going to work every time, of course, but sometimes it might stop them reaching the peak of that emotional curve, and it might keep their brain like this rather than flipping their lid. And then sometimes countdown from 5 can help as well, especially when we're dealing with kind of sensory overload and sensory overwhelm. Sometimes this can help to really just kind of bring us into the moment. And what's important is to just go to a safe space and go to that kind of sensory reduced area, if you like, whether it's that tent at the back of the room, whether it's another room in the school, something like that, but just going elsewhere and then really focusing on what you can see there. So you count down from 5, so you say, right, tell me 5 things you can see, and you point out those 5 things, 4 things you can hear, 3 things you can smell, 2 things you can touch, and then the 1 is you take 1 deep breath. And all that's doing is just, again, trying to redirect your brain and just trying to bring you into the now and really ground you and stop you feeling that kind of overwhelm, if you like. Now, there's loads. I'm aware that, you know, this is such a huge topic and there's loads that we can do, and I've tried to give you as many kind of general strategies as possible that you can take and apply depending on the setting that you're sort of working in. Now what we will do, we've got about 15 minutes left, so I'm more than happy to do some questions now for the last 15 minutes. Again, my email address is on there. If you wanted to email me afterwards, please feel free. But yeah, we can go through some questions. If I don't know the answer to your question, I will just be honest, but I will definitely direct you to the right person. But hopefully we'll be able to get through as many questions as possible. So Sophie, I'm not sure, did you want to maybe read the questions out and we do it that way, or?
Yeah, I've written down a few of them that we've been sent in. So firstly, thank you for that webinar. It was really brilliant. So the first question we have is, what are some of the main strategies that teachers can use in an inclusive classroom, since teachers may not be able to pay attention to individual needs?
Yeah, great question, and that's something that I'm always very aware of when we're talking about this, and it's very kind of, especially when we go through each of those senses, very idealistic, isn't it? And in terms of saying, right, do this for this person, but actually that might be really overwhelming for the next person. It's all just about balance, working with that group that you've got, so having different areas. So you might have an area, so if you've got someone who needs that kind of visual input, having a space where they can go to be able to do that, or anyone can go to be able to get that. So it might be kind of a very kind of visually stimulating area, and then having another space where they can go to kind of self-regulate and calm if needs be, that sensory reduced area. But it's just about balance and trying to manage that as much as possible. I would say best practice really is in terms of, and it's hard because we've got, you know, things that we need to do and displays that we need to have up and stuff, but really trying to reduce some of that overload on the displays as much as possible is general good practice. It will really kind of help those kids who are quite easily distracted visually and quite hypersensitive to that stuff. But then maybe having those alternatives, so for those kids who need that, having the coloured paper or the highlighters just on their desk, but in terms of the setup of the room, trying to reduce that as much as possible. And it sometimes is helpful to kind of build up a sensory profile on kids who you think definitely I need to think about their sensory profile and make the adjustments for them, and then kind of bring it into whole class adjustments and see who kind of gravitates towards certain things. So who might prefer those kind of brightly coloured papers and highlighters, and who actually might prefer going to that sensory reduced area, but just trying to balance the room as much as possible. But definitely it's difficult to do. One thing that's often recommended as good practice is trying to reduce that visual overload as much as possible. Excuse me, and actually just communicating with the kids as well, where it's accessible to, and asking them, where do you think you're best in the room, what distracts you, and asking them from their point of view and trying to balance and manage the room that way.
Brilliant, thank you. The next question is, we don't have any space in our classroom to be able to have things such as a sensory tent, or there isn't enough room for movement breaks. How can I help the child to calm down without disrupting the rest of the class when it's such a small space?
Yeah, and I've definitely been there as well, and some of the classrooms I used to teach in, really small, There's a couple of ways of sort of managing it, and it depends on the age and the age group and whether it's appropriate for them. But I had a boy who I used to teach. He was in my year 5 class, and we were in a very small classroom, and he needed a space to just go and calm. And one thing we did for him is we put they were like curtains, but it was just like a sheet of fabric, and we stapled it to the edge of his desk. And sometimes he'd just climb under his desk and just sit there, and that really helped him, because it didn't take up any extra space because the desk was there anyway, but it was just somewhere he could go and calm. And actually it was easy because I didn't have to kind of take him all the way over to the other end of the classroom and keep reminding him. It was always there in front of him. So sometimes that can be helpful. I've been in schools as well where they just maybe would incorporate it as, if you can see a few kids starting to go, just incorporating those relaxation breaks as like a whole class adjustment. So you might say to the class, right, every 15 minutes we're going to just have a minute, we're going to have like a minute brain break and play some calming music, and ask them to close their eyes or put their heads on the desk, or they might wear an eye mask, or however you want to do it. But especially if space is limited in terms of trying to manage it for individuals, sometimes having it as whole class adjustments too, because for those kids who maybe don't need that, it's certainly not going to do them any harm, and it's definitely going to help them with their relaxation and concentration as well. So it might be kind of having under their desk somewhere that they can go, or it might just be making that like a whole class thing, so regular kind of calming breaks, so you know it's going to benefit him, and it's certainly not going to kind of do any harm to the other kids in the classroom.
Brilliant. The next question is, how do you support non-verbal students in understanding their needs? They show very obsessive sensory seeking behaviours, which can lead to challenging behaviour. Yeah,
great question again. I think something that I mentioned before, and I did kind of gloss over it a little bit, especially when there's kind of when the student's non-verbal, is it's all about trying to use as many visuals as possible. Mood diaries are a great way of doing this. You know, like scales and 5-point scales for different emotions and things. So you might have smiley face at one end, happy face at the other, and just asking them where they are, using as many visuals as possible. Like there's loads of different varieties of it. And then when we're talking about those kind of the stress response, especially, maybe get a picture of them and talk to them about different feelings and asking them what it feels like for them, and they can point to certain areas of the body. And then they're going to need a lot of co-regulation to start with. So that self-regulation is probably going to take a lot of time, and co-regulation might be the way. So actually doing it with them and trial and error, different things. So if you think that deep breathing might help them, doing it with them and doing that co-regulation, helping them to get to that point of independence. But with non-verbal, it's just as many visuals as possible. So it might be using a visual scale for emotions, using a mood diary. You can get some great mood diaries online that've got like little stickers so they can stick in their emotions for home and school each day, and you might start to identify some patterns there in terms of their needs. So you might find, and I had this experience with someone that I was working with recently, and we found that we were trying to kind of work out his needs and what it was that was causing him to feel stressed. And because he was non-verbal, it was really difficult to do. And what we did is we used a mood diary with him, and we found that it was certain days of the week that he was really feeling overwhelmed and he was really feeling stressed. So then we looked at that pattern and thought, what's happening on those days of the weeks? And those were the days where it was PE or swimming or things like that. And actually then we would start to able to kind of draw some conclusions and think, actually maybe that's really overwhelming for him, and maybe that's what he's struggling with, and it's that kind of sensory overload from those loud noisy lessons. But it was that mood diary and just him telling us his emotions rather than telling us what he needs necessarily, just him telling us how he felt each day, that kind of helped us to start to unpick what it was that he was struggling with, and then put the adjustments in place. But it's really difficult and it can be really hard, and the answer is as many visuals as possible. Mood diaries are great, using the body outlines in terms of stress response and interoception as well, but yeah, just as many visuals as possible.
Brilliant, thank you. The next question is, as teachers, how can we work with a parent who may be reluctant to incorporate these strategies or be slightly in denial about their children's needs?
Yeah, another great question, and this is something that is so common and I come across all the time as well in my current role. The first thing is depending on what the need is, and and starting to think about how that affects them at home. And what we do find, especially when there's neurodiversity, we know that it's often genetic. I mean, my mum was in denial about the fact that I had ADHD for years until she realised that it was definitely her that I got it off. But sometimes just kind of taking that into consideration, that there can be some kind of traits of neurodiversity in the parents as well. But if they are reluctant, and if they are they don't want to put those support strategies in at home, I would say keep consistent with them in the school, and definitely be doing as much as you can in school and evidence how it's working for them. And when we're having meetings with the parents and we're talking about parents' evening, and you don't even necessarily have to put a label on it and say, oh, they've got a sensory processing disorder, or it's because they're this, or it's because they're that. You can just say, we're doing it for everyone, it's helping everyone. So I actually am recommending to all the parents that they kind of try some of these things at home, or ask the kids what's working for them and try those at home. And it'll just try and reduce some of that kind of stigma that they might have by the sounds of it, and that kind of, oh, I don't want to do that because, you know, there's I mean, I'm in quotation marks here, something that parents have said to me all the time: there's nothing wrong with my child. Of course there is nothing wrong with them. The brain just works slightly differently, but they don't quite mean it like that when they say that a lot of the time. But actually really reinforcing the benefit of what these strategies are doing for them in school, and trying to help to support them at home too. If you go on our website as well, we've got, I mean, it's about ADHD, but there's sections on kind of sensory strategies for home and stuff. But we've got a guidebook for parents on ADHD, and within that as well, there's some things about sensory integration too. So definitely worth having a look at that, and maybe sending some of that on too, just free to download off our website. But yeah, just trying to reinforce those positives as much as possible, and say how much it's working for them. And ways of reducing some of that stigma would be not necessarily putting a label on it, and just kind of talking about, you know, we're just doing this as good practice for the classroom. It's really helping him. It might be worth trying at home for him as well. But that can be really, really difficult. And if the support isn't there at home, and if they're still not doing it at home, then all you can do is just reinforce it in school as much as possible, and just keep doing the amazing job that you're doing in school.
Brilliant, thank you. The next question is, how do I support young people who are often excluded from high school due to their fight, flight and freeze responses, or emotionally based school reluctance?
Yeah, another great question. I feel like I'm saying that a lot, but another great question. And I worked with lots of PRUs recently, or alternative provisions, where we often find that's the case, and lots of the kids have ended up there because of the way that their brain operates and their emotional regulation, and that kind of fight, flight or freeze response, and maybe not being picked up on, maybe some neurodiversity there as well earlier on. Helping them to recognize that is great, but what actually might be a good starting point is there's another activity that we often use, it's worth looking up, called the stress bucket. Now, the stress bucket basically is a way of trying to reflect on what helps us and what doesn't help us. So we basically get a bucket. So you'll find, if you Google it, you'll find loads of templates online. You have a bucket, and we basically say that that's our brain, and we write in that bucket everything that causes us stress. So it might be loads of little things. It might be people winding them up. It might be the work, it might be homework, whatever it is. They write all those little things in there, and then the bucket's got two taps on it. On the left, there's a tap that empties the bucket, and on the right, there's a tap that has a hose attached to it that actually fills the bucket back up. So the difference between those two things is we've got, on the right, strategies that help us in the short term, but they don't help us in the long term, and they cause more stress because they actually fill that bucket back up. And on the left, we've got strategies that actually do help us in the long term. And on the right, when I do this with lots of kids that I work with, things that normally go on the right for them are things like fighting, lashing out, arguing with people, things like that. And the reason that they go on the right is, I had a girl recently say to me, when I hit someone, I feel better for about 2 seconds, but then I feel worse afterwards because all those other emotions come in, and the kind of consequences of hitting someone and all of that sort of stuff. But actually, she recognized that actually when she hits someone, that feeling of anger and that stress does go for a couple of seconds, but then it comes back tenfold. And then on the left, we put the things that do help us in the long term. So it would be things like talking, breathing, exercise, diet, sleep, all of those sorts of things go on the left. Now, obviously, this activity by no means a kind of miracle. But what it does do, especially for someone who has been excluded, is it's just a nice opportunity for them to reflect on, okay, what have been some of their coping strategies in the past, and has it really helped them in the long term or not, and what can we start to implement now? And then once we've done that, we can then move on to looking at recognizing those physical symptoms with the body outline template, and then start to put in some other strategies. Now, if it's physical kind of impulsivity that they're showing, and they may be lashing out and hitting people, things like resistance bands and stress balls would be really useful. If it's kind of just overwhelm and anxiety, things like relaxation and breathing techniques. But actually what I think is very important, and something that I do with lots of the kids that I work with, is try and get rid of some of that shame as much as possible. And yes, they may have made mistakes and they've ended up in the position that they are, but actually sometimes reflecting on that and thinking, no, that the way I kind of used to react, and those strategies that go on that right hose there that fills the bucket back up, so they're hitting people and lashing out, I regret doing it and I wish I didn't do it, but it's served its purpose now, and it's taught me this lesson that I don't want to do it anymore, and it's kept me safe during that time. But actually I'm ready to move on from that now, and keeping that sort of feeling of gratitude, I think is important, because I think without that we start to really have that low self-esteem, and we know lots of kids in alternative provision have already got very, very low opinions of themselves because of the kind of experience they've had. So actually looking at it not from a kind of shaming yourself point of view, but actually looking at it as like, this is what I used to do, but actually I'm now mature enough to recognize that that doesn't serve me anymore, and that doesn't help me anymore, so I'm going to start doing these things on the left instead. But definitely look into the stress bucket, nice reflective activity to maybe start that conversation and start that process.
Brilliant. We've probably got time for one more. Yeah. If a child likes using ear defenders, should they wear them in the classroom all the time, even when it's very quiet, but refuses to remove them? Will this create more of a sensory overload when they take them off?
Good question. I think what we'd have to think about is, so if it's quiet, it might not necessarily be quiet for them is the first thing to consider. So they might be like that boy that I mentioned before, really distracted by the ticking clock and things like that. So it might still be kind of, it might still be quite noisy to them in that sense, especially if there's some hypersensitivity there. In addition, it might be a comfort thing, and it might not necessarily be that auditory sense, and it could actually be that tactile sense, and it's actually that feeling of deep pressure on the head. And I often see this with kids who come into classrooms and refuse to take the coat off or refuse to take the hood down and things like that. And it's sometimes that it's just that kind of comfort thing and that kind of sensory input there. So it might be the case for them. But I do understand what you're saying in terms of, actually, is it going to become, do they need to have some times where they're not using it in terms of trying to get used to that? And the answer to that is definitely yes as well. And we do need to try and find a balance there for them. So I would say maybe have that kind of, if it's kind of appropriate and accessible, have that discussion with them about kind of fair usage of it, and think about, like, when we want to practice not using them and see what we can do. And obviously we've got that option there that if it does become overwhelming, you can just put them on. But let's try a couple of lessons, but it's going to be really quiet in this lesson. Let's try, and then that might be an opportunity for them to start to say, that's what's distracting me, and we can move them and sit them somewhere else in the room. But actually building in some of those opportunities to try to not use them, especially when it's quiet, is definitely going to be important in terms of that balance. But yeah, so firstly, just consider that maybe necessarily there might be some other things distracting them that maybe we're not picking up on, but actually giving them opportunities to practice without them is going to help them to be able to recognize and articulate that to us as well. So yeah, definitely finding that balance as much as possible.
That's brilliant. That is all we've got time for.